Sammy Davis Jr. had heard every song ever written, performed with every legend, and moved millions to tears with his own voice. But when an unknown singer performed one song backstage at the Apollo Theater, Sammy broke down crying and said 5 words that changed that performer's life forever. "That's the saddest I've ever heard." It was November 23, 1967, and the Apollo Theater in Harlem was buzzing with its usual electric energy. Amateur Night at the Apollo was legendary, the place where dreams were made or shattered in front of the most demanding audience in America. Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't scheduled to perform that night, but he'd stopped by to support some young talent and to pay his respects to the venue that had helped launch his own career decades earlier. Backstage at the Apollo was a world unto itself. The cramped, chaotic maze of dressing rooms, narrow corridors, and nervous energy. On any given amateur night, dozens of hopefuls would crowd into the backstage area, each believing they had what it took to make it in show business. Most would leave disappointed. A few would leave with their lives changed forever. Sammy had been making his rounds, offering encouragement to nervous performers and sharing stories with the theater staff who remembered him from his early days. He was heading toward the exit when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Coming from one of the small practice rooms was a voice unlike anything he'd ever heard. It wasn't technically perfect. There were no elaborate runs or showy vocal gymnastics. Instead, it was pure emotion made audible, pain given voice, heartbreak transformed into melody. The voice belonged to Sarah Washington, a 19-year-old girl from the South Bronx who had never performed professionally in her life. She'd signed up for amateur night on a dare from her friends, but now sitting alone in the tiny practice room with a borrowed guitar, she was having second thoughts. Sarah had grown up in poverty so deep that some nights she'd gone to bed hungry. Her mother had died of cancer when Sarah was 14, leaving her to care for her 2 younger brothers, while her father worked 3 jobs just to keep them housed. Music had been her escape, the one thing that helped her make sense of a world that seemed determined to break her spirit. The song she was singing that night was one she'd written herself, sitting by her mother's hospital bed during those final weeks. It was called "Empty Chair," and it was about loss so profound that it changed the shape of your world, about setting the table for someone who would never come home, about hearing phantom footsteps in empty hallways, about learning to carry love for someone who was no longer there to receive it. Sammy stood frozen in the corridor, listening to words that seemed to reach directly into his chest and squeeze his heart. Sarah's voice cracked slightly as she sang about folding her mother's clothes for the last time, about finding a grocery list in her mother's handwriting, months after the funeral. The imperfections in her delivery only made it more powerful. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession. As Sarah reached the chorus, "There's an empty chair where you used to be, and I still set a place for 3. Sammy felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Tears began streaming down his face, not the controlled tears of a professional performer, but the unguarded sobs of someone whose emotional armor had been completely penetrated. Sammy Davis Jr. had built his career on his ability to connect with audiences, to make them feel something real through his performances. He'd sung about love and loss, joy and pain, triumph and heartbreak. He'd reduced audiences to tears and lifted them to euphoria. But he'd never heard raw emotion expressed with such devastating honesty. The song lasted less than 4 minutes. But by the time Sarah finished, Sammy was sitting on the floor in the hallway, his back against the wall, crying harder than he had since his mother's death. The man who had performed for presidents and kings, who had conquered every entertainment medium, who had faced down racism and rebuilt his career after devastating injuries, was completely undone by a 19-year-old girl singing about missing her mother. Sarah finished the song and sat in silence for a moment, gathering her courage for the performance that would come next on the Apollo stage. That's when she heard the soft knock on her practice room door. "Excuse me," came a gentle voice from the other side. "May I come in?" Sarah opened the door to find Sammy Davis Jr. standing in the hallway, his eyes red with tears, his usually immaculate appearance somehow disheveled by the force of his emotional response. "Mr. Davis?" Sarah gasped. I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was listening." "Don't apologize," Sammy said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't you ever apologize for that. What I just heard, "That's the saddest I've ever heard." Those 5 words, "That's the saddest I've ever heard," coming from one of the most accomplished entertainers in the world, hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd grown up believing her voice wasn't special, that her songs were just a way to process her own pain. To hear Sammy Davis Jr., her idol, validate not just her talent but the emotional truth of her music, was overwhelming. "I wrote it for my mom," Sarah managed to say through her own tears. She died 3 years ago. Sammy stepped into the tiny practice room and sat down across from her. "Tell me about her." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah told Sammy about her mother, about Rosa Washington, who had worked as a hotel housekeeper and sung in the church choir, who had encouraged Sarah's music even when they couldn't afford a real guitar, who had made Sarah promise to keep singing even as cancer ravaged her body. "She used to say that sadness wasn't something to run from," Sarah explained. "She said sadness was just love with nowhere to go, and if you could sing it, you could help other people who had that same love with nowhere to go." Sammy listened to every word, recognizing in Sarah's story the kind of profound loss that had shaped his own life and art. He thought about his own mother, who had died when he was at the peak of his fame, leaving him with a success she'd never fully gotten to enjoy. He thought about all the songs he'd sung about heartbreak that had never quite captured what Sarah had just expressed in 4 minutes. "Sarah," Sammy said finally, "do you understand what you have?" She shook her head. "You have the gift of taking private pain and making it universal. You sing sadness in a way that doesn't just make people feel sorry for you, you make them feel connected to their own losses, their own loves, their own empty chairs. That's not just talent, that's magic." As they talked, other performers and staff members began gathering outside the practice room door, drawn by the sound of Sarah's voice and the unusual sight of Sammy Davis Jr. crying in a backstage hallway. Word spread quickly through the Apollo that something extraordinary was happening. When it came time for Sarah's performance that night, Sammy made an unprecedented decision. He asked if he could introduce her personally to the Apollo audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sammy said into the microphone as he walked onto the famous Apollo stage, "I've been coming to this theater for over 20 years. I've seen the best entertainers in the world perform on this stage. Tonight, I want to introduce you to someone who just reminded me why music exists in the first place." The Apollo audience, notoriously tough on amateur performers, fell silent. They knew Sammy Davis Jr. didn't make statements like that lightly. "This young lady is about to sing you a song that she wrote about losing her mother. It's going to break your heart, and it's going to heal it at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah Washington." Sarah walked onto the Apollo stage, carrying her borrowed guitar, still shaking from her conversation with Sammy. As she began to play the opening chords of Empty Chair, the normally raucous Apollo audience fell into a respectful quiet that was almost unprecedented for amateur night. What happened next became one of the most talked about performances in Apollo theater history. Sarah sang her song with the same raw honesty that had moved Sammy to tears, but now that honesty was amplified by the validation she'd received backstage. Her voice was stronger, more confident, but no less vulnerable. By the time she reached the final chorus, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The Apollo audience, the same crowd that had been known to boo performers off the stage, was completely silent, hanging on every word. When she finished, the applause wasn't just enthusiastic, it was reverent. But the real magic happened after Sarah left the stage. Sammy, who had been watching from the wings, walked back out to address the audience. "That young lady," he said, "just taught me something about music that I thought I already knew. She taught me that the most powerful songs aren't the ones that show off how much you can do, they're the ones that show how much you can feel." In the days that followed, Sarah Washington's life changed completely. Sammy introduced her to his record label, helped her get professional management, and personally mentored her through the process of developing her career. More importantly, he helped her understand that her vulnerability wasn't a weakness to overcome, but a strength to embrace. Empty Chair became Sarah's signature song, and her first hit record. It reached number 12 on the R&B charts and crossed over to the pop charts, something virtually unheard of for a debut single by an unknown artist. But more than its commercial success, the song became an anthem for anyone who had ever lost someone they loved. Sarah went on to have a successful recording career, but she never forgot the lesson Sammy had taught her that night at the Apollo. In interviews, she would always credit Sammy not just with launching her career, but with teaching her that authenticity was more valuable than perfection. "Mr. Davis taught me that the goal isn't to sing pretty," she would say. "The goal is to sing true. When you sing true, pretty takes care of itself." For Sammy, the encounter with Sarah Washington became a turning point in his own artistic journey. He began incorporating more vulnerability into his own performances, allowing audiences to see not just his technical skills, but his emotional depth. His recordings from the late 1960s onward showed a new willingness to expose his own pain and struggles through his music. That night at the Apollo, Sammy would later tell interviewers, "A 19-year-old girl taught me that I'd been singing about sadness my whole career, without ever really letting myself feel it. She showed me the difference between performing emotion and experiencing it." The friendship between Sammy and Sarah lasted until his death. She sang at his funeral, performing Empty Chair as a tribute to the man who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself. In her eulogy, she spoke about how Sammy had taught her that the most important audience for any artist was the audience of one, the person in the crowd who needed exactly what you had to offer at exactly the moment you offered it. "The night I met Mr. Davis," Sarah said, "I thought I was just another amateur hoping to make it through one song without embarrassing myself. But he saw something in me that I didn't know was there. He saw that my sadness wasn't something to be ashamed of, it was something to be shared. Because when we share our sadness, we remind each other that no one grieves alone." The legacy of that November night at the Apollo extended far beyond the careers of the two people directly involved. Sarah's success opened doors for other singer-songwriters who prioritized emotional authenticity over technical perfection. Her influence can be heard in the work of artists who came after her, performers who learned that vulnerability could be as powerful as virtuosity. And for Sammy Davis Jr., the encounter served as a reminder of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. In a career filled with spectacular achievements and groundbreaking performances, he would always consider those 20 minutes in a practice room at the Apollo Theater to be one of his most important experiences as an artist. "Music," Sammy would say in one of his final interviews, "is supposed to help us feel less alone with our feelings. When I heard Sarah sing that night, I realized I hadn't felt truly connected to my own sadness in years. She gave that back to me, and in return, I tried to give her the confidence to share that gift with the world." Today, Empty Chair remains a beloved classic, covered by countless artists and played at memorial services around the world. But those who know the story understand that its power comes not just from the song itself, but from the moment of recognition that created it. The moment when one of the world's greatest entertainers heard a young woman's pain and said the words that every artist dreams of hearing, "That's the saddest I've ever heard." If this incredible story of music's power to connect hearts and change lives moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who has a song that always makes them cry. Music has the power to make us feel less alone with our deepest emotions, and sometimes the most powerful performances come not from technical perfection, but from emotional truth. Let us know in the comments about a song that has moved you to tears, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories about the moments when music reminded us of what it means to be human.